The 1924 French legislative election took place on the 11th and 25th of May 1924 to elect 581 deputies to the 13th legislature of the House of Deputies. The last election had been an overwhelming victory for the newly formed Conservative National Bloc coalition, and the new Prime Minister Alexandre Millerand governed comfortably with nearly all of Parliament's lower house supporting him. One of the major issues the bloc had run on in 1919 had been against the threat of Bolshevism coming to France that it saw embodied in the rise of SFIO and electoral support and the trade unions that it was affiliated with. Just a month after Millerand took office, in February 1920, the CGT and other large trade unions launched another general strike, largely on behalf of railway workers, that gripped the country and brought back fears of Bolshevik revolution coming to France. Millerand himself saw that same threat, and he forced a law through Parliament that increased the government's surveillance powers, allowing him to spy on the activities of major unions to make sure they weren't up to no good. Millerand did not blindly stand up against the labor movement, however, and he made sure the new 8-hour workweek law adopted the previous year was enforced as it went into effect, and brought back a policy of arbitration in hopes this would limit strikes. Millerand's main concern in office, however, was making sure that the treaties of the Paris Peace Conference were put into effect, a task that would prove difficult when thousands of German workers rose up in the Ruhr, right next to France's Rhineland occupation zone. The crisis was quickly resolved, however, with the riot being put down by Germany herself. Millerand would not stay in the premiership for long, as when President Paul Deschanel suddenly resigned in September 1920 after only 7 months in office, Millerand would run to succeed him, and was overwhelmingly elected, receiving votes from all over the French political spectrum. In his first act, Millerand appointed Georges Legs, a longtime politician of the Democratic Alliance, to succeed him as Prime Minister. Legs was a rather unambitious man. He was first elected to the House in the election of 1885, but in nearly 40 years he had only held a major portfolio for 9 months, over 25 years prior. Millerand hoped to be able to cynically use Legs and govern the country through him, even as he was stuck in the presidency. Over this time, Millerand made his support clear for amending the constitutional laws of 1875 to explicitly restore the executive authority of the president over the government, but he would be unsuccessful. His ploy to use Legs would fail too, as his government would fall after just 3 months in January 1921. In office, Legs governed with almost the exact same cabinet that Millerand had left him, and his standing of his ministers quickly plummeted when his subordination to Millerand became clear. The issue that cost Legs his job, however, was his lack of firmness on forcing Germany to pay back its reparations, and the House voted no confidence in his administration on January the 12th. Understanding the situation, Millerand would call upon Aristide Briand to form his now 7th cabinet. He hoped that despite the fact that Briand was not a member of the National Bloc, his experience in having governed with every other party at some point would ensure a level of stability. This plan was successful for a little while, but it served to irritate the conservatives within the coalition at Millerand even more than they were before. The conservatives in the Republican Federation were already skeptical of Millerand, mostly due to their chronic underrepresentation both in his cabinet and in other cabinets that would follow. Of the 15 ministers in Millerand's cabinet from when he was Prime Minister, only 2 of them were from the Republican Federation, despite the fact that they were the largest party in the House of Deputies. This stemmed from Millerand's general distrust of a right in anything other than economic affairs. That went to such lengths Millerand had filled 4 portfolios of men that were not members of parliament, just to not have to give more positions to the Republican Federation. The party's leaders had nothing they could do, and their frustration went unsolved, as very few from the party were given a chance to fill a top ministry, nor were any given the chance to attain the prime ministership. However, even though the conservatives were quite unsuccessful at getting into government, they were quite effective at getting their policies implemented. No amount of governmental underrepresentation could change the fact that they were the biggest party in the House, and thus wielded a large amount of influence over legislative affairs, specifically as they came to religion. The anti-clerical laws passed at the beginning of the century were largely relaxed. Catholic religious orders that had been expelled were allowed back into the country, and public displays of religion were tolerated. The government also declined to expand a 1905 separation of church and state law to the newly acquired Alsace-Lorraine, where Catholicism remains the state religion to this day. On the diplomatic front, the government also restored good relations with the papacy. The biggest legislative success of the conservatives, however, came in mid-1920, when a national law was passed that both banned abortion and the use of birth control. This was a proposal that the Republican Federation had long supported, due to its Catholic roots. But the concern there was for population growth had been caused by the hole that the First World War had put into the French population, which caused this proposal to pass overwhelmingly, with only the SFIO voting against it. Back in office, Briand would not last long, as he would get into multiple disputes over foreign policy with President Millerand, who disapproved of his appeasing attitude towards German reparations in practice, even if he talked a big game. Millerand eventually succeeded in getting Briand to resign the following January, and he was succeeded by Raymond Poincaré, who would govern the entire rest of a parliamentary term. Under Poincaré, the national government would undergo another rightward drift, as he staffed nearly all the top positions in his cabinet with members of the Democratic Alliance, and relocated the few radicals who supported the bloc government to low-ranking ministries. Taking a much more conservative stance than every prime minister to come before him on the economy, he was very hawkish on balancing the French budget. This led into what Poincaré's second ministry is most remembered for, the occupation of the Ruhr. Poincaré's idealized balanced budget would require timely German reparation payments, and so from the beginning he took a much more hawkish stance than his predecessors towards Germany, which became a problem when Germany was increasingly running behind on its payments. Germany failed to honor its monthly debt payment in November of 1922, and thus Poincaré ordered that the French military invade Germany and occupy the Ruhr Valley, one of Germany's strongest industrial areas, planning to take the money directly in raw materials. This plan failed, as most Germans refused to work in the factories after the French arrived, and clashes that occurred between soldiers and civilians turned worldwide public opinion against France, and left it diplomatically isolated, which upset the European markets and lowered confidence in the French economy. Eventually, France agreed to withdraw, folding on everything whilst gaining nothing, but now was left diplomatically and economically isolated. Poincaré attempted to salvage the economic situation by greatly devaluing the franc, and tried to make up for France's debt problem by raising the income tax, which served to greatly harm his government's goodwill among the public. All of this coincided with a resurgence of the French left. Radical Party leader Edouard Herriot had been scarred by the great defeat that his alliance suffered in the last election, and wanted to prevent it from happening again. The French left had suffered in the previous election because they were divided, and it was clear that they could not make the same mistake again. Herriot began negotiating with the SFIO's leadership for a left-wing coalition that will be centered around 5 main principles. 1. The legal respect and enforcement of labor laws. 2. A rejection of Poincaré's fiscal and monetary policy. 3. A stricter application of the income tax. 4. A return to the anti-clerical status quo of the century's start. And 5. A more diplomatic foreign policy that would work more through the League of Nations, a new international organization that had been set up after the war to prevent another one from breaking out. Together, the Radical Party, the Republican Socialist Party, and the SFIO would form a left cartel coalition that would work as a unified left-wing force, but with a little catch. Leon Blum, a member of the SFIO's executive committee, proposed that the SFIO would not directly participate in the cartel's government, but would instead offer confidence and supply within the House of Deputies. The National Bloc was further weakened as they would be left without the independent radicals, but after years of drifting away from the increasingly conservative bloc, officially withdrew from Poincaré's government at the start of 1924. The radicals' alliance with the SFIO was made easier by the fact that its most extreme members that had hurt the party's image had now left the party, including Secretary General Frossard. To give some context, Frossard had been converted to communist ideology after he visited the Soviet Union. He would come back in time to attend the SFIO's 18th National Congress in 1920, at which the party would be divided over the 21 propositions that had been issued by Lenin as preconditions for membership in the Third Internationale. A majority of the party ended up rejecting these propositions, but the minority that did would split off and form the French section of the Communist Internationale, which the following year would adopt the name it is still known by to this day, the Communist Party. The party's first general secretary was Mr. Frossard, but he soon resigned and the party selected Pierre Samar as his successor, who had long been a committed member of the labor movement. The communists rejected all cooperation with the cartel, which led them to just campaign against the National Bloc. There was strong momentum on both sides going into election day, and any one of them could have realistically come out on top. It was known by all involved that no matter the victor, the election would be a close one. Going to election day, however, the bloc were confident that their large majority would protect them from defeat. Now let's see the results! In a huge reversal, the National Bloc were kicked from power after just one term, with the left cartel successfully winning 287 seats. A plurality, but not a majority. This win was overwhelmingly attributed to the new coalition, which benefited under the proportional electoral system. The bloc itself fell all the way to 199 seats, a far cry from the supermajority they had managed to win in the previous election. This defeat would bring the end of a national bloc. They were now down to just a Republican Federation and Democratic Alliance working together, when they had started as a coalition supported by 4 whole parties and countless independents. The National Bloc was dead, but its example would inspire every center-right French political coalition to come after it, until the modern day. Unlike Clemenceau before him, Poincaré was unable to paint the left as extreme Bolsheviks, as the most extreme members of the party had already exited to create the Communist Party, which helped the image of SFIO and the cartel as a whole significantly. Speaking of the communists, they had a decent first showing, capturing 26 seats and nearly 10% of a popular vote, with their support being especially concentrated in the industrial heartland along the border of Belgium and Paris's industrial suburbs. Following the election, Poincaré resigned, and this left President Mitterrand to choose a successor. In an act of defiance, he did not appoint a member of the victorious cartel, and instead chose Frédéric François Marchal on June 8th, who was instantly kicked out of office by a no-confidence vote. Mitterrand, however, refused to appoint a left-wing prime minister, preferring to resign instead. The cartel quickly organized a presidential election for the 13th of June, just 2 days after Mitterrand's resignation. His very fast acting prevented much campaigning, and so it was no surprise that the 2 immediate frontrunners were both former prime ministers, Gaston Doumergue of the Radical Party and Paul Painlevé of the Republican Socialist Party. Painlevé came out on top of a preparatory vote on the 12th, although not with a majority. When the actual vote came, Dumir came out ahead, largely thanks to votes on the right of the House who saw him as the lesser evil compared to Painlevé. Things were not all bad for Painlevé, however, as he was given the presidency of the House of Deputies as a consolation prize. Taking the oath of office on the same day as his election, President Dumir would appoint Herriot as Prime Minister, and just like what had been agreed upon in the coalition deal, no socialists would enter government as ministers. But the SFIO would still provide the government with confidence and supply. However, since the cartel had failed at winning a majority, Herriot's government was forced to reach out to the 40 independent radicals that had been elected, which gave his government a narrow majority. This would make governing difficult, as to pass anything, Herriot would require support from both the SFIO and the independent radicals, two political factions that had often fought against one another and refused to cooperate. You would need to play both of them off against each other if you wanted to accomplish anything as Prime Minister. The government's position was also weakened by the fact that despite winning the election, the cartel had lost the popular vote to the bloc, which made it clear that under just slightly better conditions, the parties of the now dissolved bloc could stage a comeback. Will Herriot be able to overcome these tense conditions? Find out next time for the legislative election of 1928. Thanks for watching.